Howdy, I'm Dr. Sonia Hernandez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at Texas A&M University, and I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about the Mexican-American War, or the War of 1846, through the lens of Texas. So I want to get us started by thinking about three questions to guide our lecture. The first question: what were the causes that led to the War of 1846? What was the experience of Tejanos, including women, during the war and after the war? And finally, what were the long-term consequences of the war? So let us get started with this material. Well, I want to talk about the Mexican-American War, the War of 1846, or from the Mexican historical and historiographical perspective, La Guerra del 46. In terms of what it did for the United States. So the war was a real turning point. It was a watershed moment for several reasons. For the U.S., it doubled its size, and it strategically positioned it as a much stronger country, politically speaking and militarily speaking. We know that many of the soldiers who fought during the War of 1846 then used that military experience and applied it to the Civil War. And there are also famous officers who got their, they got their feet wet, so to speak, during the Mexican-American War, and then moved on to officer positions during the Civil War. Now, for Mexico, it really left it quite vulnerable. You know, Mexico lost its northern frontier, what was known as La Frontera Norte, and lost half of its territory, and it left the country in a very fragile position, politically speaking and economically speaking. It also had to do with, or the eventual loss of the war on the part of Mexico had a lot to do with the internal situation in Mexico at that time. For the U.S., on the other hand, not only did it position the U.S. in a much more strategic position, but it also led to the creation of a new demographic. It essentially, overnight, after the end of the war, it led to the creation of Mexican Americans, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. The war also presented a set of challenges with respect to land tenure, especially when it came to protecting the property rights of this new demographic of Mexican Americans. It also certainly presented a mix of opportunities and other challenges, including opportunities for women in what was considered the ceded territories, or that land that had belonged to Mexico and now was under U.S. jurisdiction. Well, and the seeds of the Mexican-American War had been planted much earlier, since the early 19th century. We know that tensions had grown between the United States and Mexico, certainly over the issue of Texas, and this was due to several factors. We know that Texas, and if we talk about early 19th century Texas history, we're talking about Texas. The history of Texas. We know that residents of Texas were concerned with the physical distance from central Mexico, the core of the country. They were concerned about economic issues related to taxation and, of course, other matters, most notably the matter of slavery. Remember when Mexico, you think back to your world history courses, your U.S. history courses, and think about Mexican independence, which is actually just right around the corner. Mexico gained its independence in 1821 from Spain, and with independence, Mexico had abolished slavery. Now, this did not sit well with the residents of Texas, because a lot of Texans, these Anglo newcomers that were coming from the United States, moving into the province of Texas, mixing in with the Tejano population there. Many of those folks felt that the only way forward, economically speaking, for the province was in fact slavery. Now, they knew that slavery was key, was actually crucial to the survival and the expansion of agriculture, and because agriculture required a steady supply of labor. And given the overwhelming majority of the newcomers who had moved to Texas, most of them, well over 60% of them, came from the U.S. South. What defined the U.S. South at that time? The system of slavery. And so many of them brought their slaves with them. And so this, of course, is part of the eventual move toward Texas independence, or what some scholars also call, the Texas Revolt or the Texas Revolution, or from the Mexican scholarly perspective, La Rebelión de Texas, which eventually culminates, in 1836, seals Texas independence from Mexico. But, Mexico had never really acknowledged Texas independence. And so when a majority of Texans supported annexation by 1845, Texas had in fact become part of the United States. But the boundary issue had never been quite settled. The Texans and eventually the Americans claimed the U.S., eventually claimed the Nueces River near the Corpus Christi area as the boundary, while the Mexicans claimed the Rio Grande, or what they called the Rio Bravo, as the real or legitimate boundary. Well, all of this does not happen in, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so it's really important to understand the larger context here. Think back to what you've learned from your earlier U.S. history courses. This is happening, smack in the middle of the 19th century. The U.S. is dealing with the so-called, quote, Indian problem. U.S. policy would soon turn to the creation of reservations. And there was, this westward movement in terms of settlement. And think of the larger ideological or philosophical concept that came to be known as manifest destiny, right? That eventually helped push the country closer to war with Mexico. And the manifest destiny was this idea that stated that the U.S. had some sort of divine right to move forward and acquire more territory. Well, we can spend a whole hour talking about, the detailed sort of step-by-step, developments that eventually led us to war with Mexico. But just briefly here, a skirmish would eventually take place in the region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, and where lives were lost. And this was an opportunity for the U.S. president at the time, James K. Polk, to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. And we know from his famous speech to Congress, where he says, quote, American blood has been spilled in American soil, end of quote. And this, he uses this to ask for and really demand for a declaration of war, and it does happen, and the U.S. declares war on Mexico, but really American blood had been spilled, and also Mexican blood, in disputed territory. This issue had not been settled quite yet. I will say that the Mexican-American War quickly became unpopular. Even future President Abraham Lincoln condemned it. A series of prominent writers of the time also would come to condemn it. But for the U.S., it was an opportunity to show, its military force. And, going back to this question about why Mexico was in a position, why was it that Mexico lost so much land? And, Mexico is dealing with its own internal issues. The Tejanos were not, and the Texans were not the only ones who were in rebellion We think of places like Yucatan, further south. If you're, think of a map of Mexico, you think of Zacatecas, the mining region of Zacatecas. And those places were also in rebellion. So the war would end rather quickly. It ended in 1848, and what sealed the end of the war was the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, which was signed in early February of 1848. And, that's the official, document that ended the war. And the consequences of the treaty were quite significant. I mean, not only did Mexico cede what is now the U.S. Southwest, California, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, parts of Utah, Arizona, and certainly Texas. But that land was had been populated with subjects of the Mexican Republic, and now literally overnight became Mexican Americans and were granted U.S. citizenship and other kinds of protections. Now, the issue of land protections would not be so clear-cut, and we'll see why that was the case. So, for just going back to this, what the war did for the United States, I mean, it doubled its size. It really, placed the U.S. in a pretty important strategic position, gaining almost over 529,000 square miles of land. The other significance of the treaty was that it finally settled the issue of the boundary. So what we now know as the present day geopolitical boundary between the U.S. and Mexico was in fact established in 1848. So on the eastern end, you had the river, the Rio Grande serving as the natural landmark. On the western end of the almost 2,000 mile long border, you have a land border. Well, what was life like for these Mexican Americans in post-war society? Well, most Mexican Americans had a positive outlook toward their new government. Now they were under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. But if you recall, and again, I'm sort of packing lots of history here, but the settlers in places like Texas and in places like what eventually became California and others, I mean, those settlers dealt constantly with surprise attacks by Native Americans. And they often complained, just like they complained to the Spanish crown when that region was part of Spain, they also complained to the Mexican Republic that the government was, could never quite handle this so-called Indian problem. And so they felt that this was an opportunity to get some kind of real protection from this new government. So the outlook was overall positive. Now, for the case of Texas, what was it like for those Texas Mexican Americans or those Tejanos who, now were under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government? Well, as new subjects of the government, most individuals had to register or re-register, I should say, their property because now it was U.S. property. And many of them, we're talking about families whose, land titles had gone lost. We're talking about, language obstacles. A lot of these titles were in Spanish. People had to pay for translation, right, to get those translated. There were fees involved. In fact, so many Mexican Americans lost their land because they oftentimes paid with their land chunks, parcels of land in return for those services, right? To pay for those services. Not to mention the problem of squatters. I mean, this was more of a problem in places like California than places like Texas. But you know, specifically, if we think of the gold rush in California, as more and more people were flooding the area, a lot of these families had not recorded land transfers within the family. These were verbal agreements. So a family gave a certain number of acres to a son, a certain number of acres to another son, a certain number of acres to a daughter. And a lot of that was verbally, it was done verbally. Attorney fees, and as I mentioned, translation fees were other ways that Mexican Americans lost land. And one of the other causes or factors contributing to land loss or land transfer was intermarriage, was the practice of intermarriage. And I'll talk a little bit more about intermarriage in one other slide. But just let me quickly show you here a map showing the porciones, and porciones was, or a porción was a Spanish land grant. And these were, grants, parcels of land, gosh, dating back to, the 1700s, some even earlier. And if we go to places, for example, like South Texas, we could still identify some of the families in that area that can trace their lineage all the way back to the 1700s, when that area was settled actually in 1749. So talking about families like the Cantu family, the Chapas, the Hinojosas, just to name a few. Now, some of these families were considered rico families, and rico means rich, although we're not talking about, cash in hand, like liquid capital. We're talking about considered affluent, rich because of their land, right? They were part of the landed elite. Some even had access to political office. We know that in the post-war period up to the right before the dawn of the 20th century, at least 7 Tejanos served in the state legislature. But there was loss of land in many cases. And one of those factors contributing to these changes in land tenure had to do with intermarriage. So intermarriage at this particular time usually happened between an affluent, a landed Tejana, right, landed woman of Spanish, Mexican, and in some cases indigenous descent, marrying not so affluent Anglo-American men who had moved to the area in the aftermath of the war or during the war to make a new life, to find new economic opportunities, whether it was in trade or some other way. And so women had been able to own land and manage land. These rights had carried over from, earlier, from the Spanish and later Mexican periods. So under U.S. jurisdiction, women's rights did change, right? They were in fact more limited if we compare, right, if we look at the differences between Anglo-American legal tradition and Spanish-Mexican legal tradition. While women could not vote nor serve on juries, women could in fact make contracts, sue someone, or be sued. They could own their property. They could certainly control it. And widows in particular had additional rights given their sole custody over their children. Single women in Texas had by far the least of rights, which in the legal system, it resembled almost sort of the rights of minors. Right? But Texas women who had owned land could keep it under this was after the war, under Texas state law, in fact, that granted or guaranteed, I should say, women's rights to own separate property. And, you know, reflecting Spanish legal tradition, in 1856, the law in Texas stated, quote, that anyone of sound mind could make a will and a testament, end of quote, including women. But post-war society, in post-war society for Tejanas, they would experience land loss in a slightly different way, as land titles were changed and now reflected new surnames, you know, in situations of intermarriage, you know, with men of, you know, Anglo-American men, and in some cases, German-American men. Now, for many Tejano families, intermarriage was part of, you know, of some type of strategic alliance, some kind of way to claim a space in this new post-war society. I mean, there's a well-known example between Salome Bayi from the prominent Bayi family. If you think of, you know, La Isla del Padre, South Padre Island, right? That's Padre Bayi. That's named after Padre Bayi. Well, Salome Bayi from that prominent family would end up marrying John McCallan. And, you know, just to give you an example of her wealth, you know, at age 29, Salome Bayi owned about $100,000 in real property and about $25,000 in personal property. In 1860, she was, quote, one of 4 individuals born in Mexico and now a Mexican-American or Tejana, enumerated in a group of 263 wealthy Texans, end of quote. Her family owned the Santa Anita Ranch. That's in present-day northern Hidalgo County, and that now is considered part of the McCallan Ranch. And that's because by 1905, the ranch became registered under the McCallan name, but it was originally part of the Bayi family. And we have a portraits here of both Salome Bayi and John McCallan, one of the more well-known examples of intermarriage in the post-war period. And, you know, it should not surprise us why we have McAllen, Texas, and not Bayitown or, you know, Bayiville or something like that. But it also is really important to know this earlier history because, you know, the history of places like South Texas, they don't begin in 1905. They don't begin at the turn of the 20th century. They began much, much earlier, and that's why this period is pretty crucial. You know, they're not the only example. We are very fortunate to have access to a collection of photographs in the Center for American History called the Robert Runyon Collection. That's at UT Austin, and there's a series of portraits of interethnic marriages during the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century, which will, you know, give us an idea of you know, these marriages and the importance of these intermarriages as well. Well, despite these challenges, particularly concerning land tenure, Mexican Americans in Texas persisted, and albeit, you know, unevenly became incorporated into this post-annexation, post-war society. You know, roughly between 165,000 to 190,000, give or take, Tejanos or Spanish surname Americans lived in Texas by the turn of the 20th century, living in population centers like San Antonio, West Texas, South Texas, and East Texas, and places like Houston and other places like Galveston. But for the majority of Mexican Americans, you know, by the close of the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, the majority of Mexican Americans would begin to form part of a growing working class that would be comprised of small landowners that also were, considered farmers, right? So we're talking about small farmers, including women who took on double duties at home and in agriculture, and some in ranching. It included cowboys, or the, vaqueros, which included a majority of, Mexican origin cowboys, but also African American cowboys. And these vaqueros, they tended to be, they had much more prestige or status as compared to, say, a ranch hand or a peon. But they still did not own land. They were pretty much, landless. But they still, they formed part of the working class. You also had in this group a growing number of cartmen or arrieros, and these were folks that were focused on transporting goods and commodities, right, from one point to another. Bringing, this is important to point out that, these folks were bringing goods from what was now northern Mexico into places like Laredo and San Antonio, Corpus Christi, Houston, but that had always occurred. The border did not, the creation of the border in 1848 did not disrupt those economic, social, and certainly cultural relationships that had existed in the pre-war period. And so, they formed part of this growing group, and certainly ranch hands, peons, who were, working in a lot of the land that had originally been settled as part of, the Spanish land grant system, or, these porciones. And peons, for the most part, they were at the bottom of this growing working class, living in homes like the one that appears here. This is an image from the Library of Congress, and this was a typical jacal of the period. And actually, jacales are these, homes built out of, the natural environment, provided housing for the scores of workers who provided their services to the ranches, many of the ranches that are still around, and also the large farms, especially as commercial agriculture began to dominate over the ranching economy, certainly in certain parts of the state. So let us recap and look at the legacies of the Mexican-American War, specifically looking at it from the Texas case, or the Texas experience. Well, the Mexican-American War had much to do with the situation in Texas. Texas certainly plays a pivotal part in the eventual tensions that caused this international war, certainly since the 1830s, since the days of the Texas Revolution, which had a lot to do with the practice of slavery. And certainly the growth of Anglo-American immigration, right, the movement of Anglo-Americans from the United States to places like Texas, and of course the issue of the boundary, which would eventually be settled in 1848. The end of the war positioned the United States in a much stronger place in terms of military experience, acquisition of land, right? And not just any land, but it was fertile land. If you think of Texas in the 19th century and first part of the 20th century, Texas land was rich for agriculture and eventually for commercialized agriculture, and not to mention also land with precious metals and minerals like California and Arizona. We think of the mining sectors there. Despite protections, extended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that sealed the end of the war, many Tejanos did lose their land. And for women, this also brought certain changes. I mean, whether it was in the area of marriage or in the area of economic opportunities, and certainly with respect to women's rights concerning their property, the war had a significant impact on their lives. And the last point, as commercial agriculture began to take shape in the early 20th century, that growing working class that found themselves, landless, comprised of the cartmen, the arrieros, the peons, ranch hands, vaqueros, or these cowboys, they would end up performing the bulk of what was considered stoop labor, when you stoop over and you pick crops. They would comprise the bulk of that labor force that made it possible for places like Texas and others to claim a space in the world of agriculture and increase its agricultural production. Overall, the Mexican-American War, through the lens of Texas, provides a crucial window into larger developments related to westward expansion, the creation of the geopolitical border between Mexico and the United States, and the complex process of incorporation of Mexican Americans into post-war society and its numerous challenges. Thank you very much.